Hello, everybody. This is our first of hopefully a number of lectures that I'll take. The idea is that you'll watch the recordings, listen to the lecture, and then at the end of the lecture, we'll review some of the concepts and you'll take a short quiz on as you learn. So you could do these at your own pace, but I'm hoping that you can do them as we go. We've already kind of talked about today's topic in a number of different ways. So today we're going to talk about plants and photosynthesis in agroecology. And in many ways, it's something that's intuitive. We look at a forest, we look out at a garden, and we can imagine photosynthesis happening. We see the sunlight hitting leaves, we see things growing, and we kind of know that that's what's going on. We want to look a little bit deeper at the process of photosynthesis and how it affects the variability in agroecosystems and how it kind of presents both management problems and management opportunities. So we want to, it's not about getting at all of the details and kind of scientific technical details of photosynthesis, but I do want you to understand enough of this so that you can think about its implication for the structure of agroecosystems. Okay? All right, so again, we have three objectives for this short lecture. First one is to understand the basic process of photosynthesis. Second is to understand the different types of photosynthesis in crop plants. So we're going to talk about a couple of different pathways or variations that have evolved and that we take advantage of in agroecosystems. And then third, I want to understand how photosynthesis can be limited by light, humidity, and carbon dioxide. So these are some of the kind of key factors that we think of as being inputs, although you'll see they're not the only ones. These are the key inputs. So those are our three objectives. I'll just say as we go through this, I want you to kind of imagine or pay attention to things that are in boldface. These are concepts that you'll want to remember or terms, and we may come back to those in some of the quizzes. So as we go through this, that's an important factor. Okay, again, if we started this, we think about why is it important to understand kind of plants and their processes? Well, they are really the basis of all life because they're the kind of the beginning of our trophic level. They're the ones that are able to capture solar energy from the sun, store it in forms that they can use and that other organisms can use as well. So herbivores and others can use. We often think of plants or define plants as being autotrophic, meaning that they're self-nourishing or self-feeding, right? Because they use photosynthesis, plants, and water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight to build their own bodies, right? So we think of them as kind of building their own. I want you to think about this, understand this as a definition, and that it is used to apply to plants. But think critically about it too, because there's other things that might be needed. They're not in kind of a closed system. They require other things as well. So photosynthesis, this is a process that works against the second law of thermodynamics. Now that second law of thermodynamics says basically that nature wants to go from higher energy to lower energy states, that we're moving away from organization and moving towards chaos, that we're moving towards entropy. And if you think about it, plants are one of the few examples of where we do the opposite. Plants are able to take more kind of low energy, solar energy, and condense it into chemical energy, which is more concentrated. So that's kind of a pretty amazing transformation that it does. And we wouldn't be here if it weren't for that process. Okay, so photosynthesis. Let's think about this for a second. So everybody knows this a little bit. So the process combines water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide to create glucose, which is a simple sugar, oxygen, and water. Okay, there's the formulas at the bottom, but I don't want you to focus too much on it, but just know it's carbon dioxide plus water plus light energy gives us a carbohydrate or a sugar, glucose, and oxygen and water. And so we know that these are, and it's interesting to note too, it takes in more water than it gives off. There's 12 waters that come in, 12 H2Os, and 6 that go out. But the water has to be present, even though there's a net loss at the end. Glucose then glucose is a simple sugar. It's a relatively short-chained hydrocarbon. carbohydrate that's used by plants and animals to make more complex carbohydrates, or it can be converted directly to energy, right? So we can build it into more complex forms, or it can be used for energy. And it can be used by both plants and by animals as well. This is a picture of garlic here. I've just put it there because you can kind of imagine it. You can see the sunlight reflecting on it, converting and being converted into, in this case, glucose, which is used and eventually stored in the plant. Okay, when we think about photosynthesis, I want us to dive a little bit deeper and understand two parts of the photosynthesis process. These are called the light reactions and dark reactions. And these happen in different ways, and they happen at different kind of points in time. Okay, so we want to think about these, and I do, again, I've kind of put these in bold, so I do want you to remember these, right? So light reactions are reactions that convert solar energy to chemical energy in the form of NADPH. You don't have to know what that stands for, but it basically, it's important to think that this converts, so it's water and solar energy are converted into an energy form, into a chemical energy form. It doesn't include the carbon dioxide. There's no carbon in this part of it, but it's changing the form of that solar energy. Okay, it's changing it into a chemical form, which is pretty kind of remarkable, to change light energy into a chemical that embodies in its bonds energy, and we call this process phosphorylation, right? And part of it is because there's phosphorus that's used as a part of this energy transfer. But it's the light reaction, changing the form of the energy. The dark reactions is where carbon comes in. So dark reactions combine carbon atoms from carbon dioxide to create simple sugars, glucose or photosynthate, through carbon fixation. So if you can imagine this is the process that peels off the carbon from carbon dioxide and combines it with part of the oxygen and hydrogen from water, and it's going to turn it into sugars, right? So it's going to change its form. But this is important because this is the carbon fixation part. And we think that this is important because that carbon becomes essential as a building block. It's a building block for other compounds. It's also becomes those carbohydrates become a source of energy because there's energy locked in those bonds. And it's also important from a carbon sequestration, carbon sink point of view in terms of climate action. If we want to grow plants, both above ground and below ground material in order to hold carbon, we want to think about this carbon fixation process, right? So these are happening at different times. Light reactions require the presence of light, which makes sense because it's converting light energy into chemical energy. Dark reactions don't require the dark, but they can occur in the absence of light. So these are non-light reactions, if you will, rather than dark per se. But there's, again, think of these two different processes. Light reactions change the form of solar energy into chemical energy. Dark reactions sequester carbon, fix carbon from carbon dioxide, and store it into these longer carbohydrate chains or sugar chains, which embody energy and can be used as building blocks. And the dark reactions are also often referred to as the Calvin cycle. Okay. Now, I just wanted to put up one diagram because I kind of need to see diagrams like this. But I want us to think of these. This is what's happening at a kind of a micro level. And so I want you to, there's some spinach plants off to the right, and I just want you to try to, again, have a Ms. Frizzle Magic School Bus moment where we dive in at an atomic level and think about what's happening in these two different these two different kinds of reactions, right? So I want you to kind of imagine this chemical kind of cycle happening at the very surface at a micro level within these spinach plants, right? And so if you look at this diagram, the left part of this is our light reaction. Sunlight plus water results in this kind of, through this process of photophosphorylation, gives off oxygen, which we enjoy. We like that the plants do this. And it also creates ATP and NADPH, which is these are these chemical forms that embody energy, that atoms are bound together in a way that there's a high amount of energy kind of locked up in them. And this becomes the kind of the energy source for the next part of the process. Okay, so the right side of this diagram is the dark reaction. This is where the plant takes in carbon dioxide through its stomata, which are these little holes. It takes it in. It uses the energy, the chemical energy that's created on the first part of the process, the light reaction part of the photosynthesis, and it converts it through this Calvin cycle. And we're not going to go into the details of it, but it uses it to create these carbohydrates. And again, these carbohydrates are chains, long kind of links with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen linked together, and other things as well. But it's basically, imagine it pulling off the carbon and the oxygen from carbon dioxide in order to link it up together. This energy that was kind of created in the first process and used in the second process is kind of conceptually, it gets embodied in those links between the different carbons, right? So think about how strong it is and how, in that sense. Okay? And then some of that energy can then go, or some of the byproducts of that go back in and get kind of re-energized, if you will, in the light reaction, and then come back in. Okay? So this is what's happening at this micro level. And I just want you to be kind of thinking about, trying to imagine it happening at that level. Okay? So an important part of photosynthesis is to understand kind of how this process affects limitations related to water or humidity and temperature. And to understand this, we're going to think about the fact that plants, so they take in, they take in carbon dioxide through leaf openings called stomata. And stomata, they're these holes, or these openings in the leaf, in the actual kind of surface of the leaf. And you can see in kind of an image on the right-hand side up here of an actual stomata, and then here kind of a more conceptual one. So two things are happening when stomata are open. It does, first of all, this is how carbon dioxide comes into the leaf and becomes available to the dark reactions. The second thing that's important is to know is that the stomata are also what result in transpiration. And this is the process of water release. And so remember that kind of part of the second part of the dark reactions is this release of water into the kind of back out into the air through the process of transpiration. So that's kind of almost like a waste product. And we can see the transpiration. If you ever take a leaf and you cover it with a plastic bag, you can see the condensation, or it's not condensation, but the water vapor condensing on the inside of that plastic bag, right? So this is being released in really humid air. And it's not that different in a way that, since that when we exhale, we're exhaling water as well, water vapor, but imagine plants breathing out that water. So it's doing these two things at the same time, trying to take in carbon dioxide and then also releasing water vapor through transpiration. When temperatures get too high, or when the air is too dry, when humidity is too low, plants have a problem. They start losing more kind of water or humidity from their stomata than they can afford to do, right? They're going to lose too much and they're going to essentially dry out if they keep losing it. So they need to close down their stomata to avoid losing too much water. They get overheated, and so they shut down. They shut down the stomata as a means to keep the water in. So if you think about it from the diagram below on the right, if you want to get that carbon dioxide coming in through an open stomata, but you want to make sure that you don't lose too much water as well. So you shut it down. This is a problem. So this means, especially if you're in a warm environment or in a dry environment, and especially during the day, the plant wants to shut down the stomata to keep from losing too much water. So normally, because the light reactions and the dark reactions are happening at the same time, this is a problem because it doesn't have then enough carbon dioxide to carry out the rest of the dark reaction, right? So it's closed down, but it's essentially stops functioning at that point in time. It's a real problem because if it closes down and stops being able to bring in carbon dioxide during the day, well, that's the time when the light reaction is going on as well. So we get kind of a backlog. There's not enough carbon dioxide coming in for the dark reaction, and which means the light reaction kind of gets backed up. There's not it doesn't have a place to hold it. There's no storage bins to hold the energy in, and so the plant gets to a point where it's more energy to try to where it's not able to keep building. This point at which the carbon dioxide levels in the leaf go too low is called the carbon dioxide compensation point. It's just the point at which there's not enough carbon dioxide there to carry out the dark reactions. So evolutionarily, plants have developed different strategies for adapting to this bottleneck, this real problem of, and again, I want you to kind of visualize this. It's getting too hot. I'm a plant leaf. It's getting too hot. I'm losing too much water. I got to close down my stomata so that I don't lose too much, right? So evolutionarily, plants have developed a couple different variations on the photosynthetic pathway. Okay, what we call C3. This just happens to do with how many carbons are in the cycle that is fixing the carbon. But C3 photosynthesis, or C3 type of photosynthesis, is the typical pathway that we just showed you, right? Light reactions are converting energy, while dark reactions are fixing the carbon. So this is the typical pathway that's used the C3 plants use this typical pathway that we described above, and it's really the most common plants in temperate regions. Now, you should think about that for a second, and it might be a question I'll ask later, but so why is it? Ask yourself, why is it that C3 plants would be more common in temperate regions? So just reflect on that for a moment. And the reason is, one of the reasons is, and I'm sure you're thinking about this, is that it's less likely in temperate regions to have this problem of being high heat and low humidity. So they're less likely to have to shut down their stomata. So they didn't have as much of an evolutionary pressure to come up with a new pathway to deal with it. Whereas tropical or more arid plants had a pressure because they kept running into this block of it being too hot or too dry. Okay, so we'll see that most temperate crops, a lot of temperate plants use that C3 pathway that's described above. Now, C4 plants are kind of the more, you think of this as a recent evolutionary adaptation. So the C4 plants are able to grab carbon dioxide from the air and store it within the leaf before it enters the dark reaction. Okay, so try to think about this for a second. So again, the kind of the bottleneck that occurs is that the dark pathway, normally in the C3 pathway, the dark reactions are slowed down because the plant has to close its stomata. And so what this does is it allows the plants, the C4 pathway allows the plant to keep grabbing carbon dioxide from the air and storing it within the leaf even before it enters the dark reaction, right? And what it can do in this case is it can do this with less transpiration, and it can do it during the dark as well. So so all of a sudden it becomes a place to stock up on carbon or carbon dioxide. It comes in as carbon dioxide. It's stored as a different form of carbon in chloroplasts, and it's able to kind of essentially become a stockyard, an inventory of carbon. that can be used later in the dark reaction. And what that allows us to do is that if the plant has to close its stomata at some point in time, it has this stored up carbon that's kind of held in a reserve that it can use. So it can close its stomata to keep from having too much transpiration, but it can still have the dark reactions going on. Okay, what some of the common plants for doing this, and you're wondering why is there a picture of Rick with next to corn? This is Ben on my shoulders. This is bloody butcher corn. Corn and grasses are one of the most common examples of C4 plants. Most of the grasses evolved in savanna, drier, hotter conditions. They still also evolved in other kind of temperate zones as well. But the majority of grasses are C4, and things like sorghum and corn are kind of great examples of C4 plants that are able to do this. Okay? Again, if we compare C3 and C4 plants, C4 plants, again, tend to be more effective under high light and warm temperatures. In cooler temperatures, that process, that adaptation of the process where they store their carbon in a different part of the cycle actually comes at an energy cost. So in lower light, shadier, cooler temperatures, they're really not as efficient, right? So C4 plants are really efficient at high light and warmer temperatures, but they don't do well in shade. They don't do well in they do fine in warm climates, like around here. Kind of wetter climates, as long as there's lots of if they're warmer and lots of solar radiation. Again, this extra step in the photosynthesis in C4 plants can make them inefficient in lower light and moderate temperatures. So that we kind of see, here's a list of plants, and again, this is showing their net photosynthetic rate. So how many milligrams of carbon do they fix or do they take in per decimeter? So per unit area of leaf per hour. So what's the rate at which they fix carbon dioxide? And again, what you'll see is some of the C3 plants like spinach, tobacco, wheat, rice, beans, in these high light and warm temperatures do not perform as well. But they do perform better in cooler temperatures. So if you grow spinach around here, you realize that you don't want to grow it in the middle of summer. You want to grow it in the spring, and you want to grow it in the fall. It does just fine in those environments. And in fact, in the summer, it overheats, and it has to, you can imagine that spinach wanting to shut down its stomata and do that, and not be able to grow. Similarly, corn, you don't start growing until later in the season, in part because it can freeze, it can be stunted due to a cold spell, but it doesn't. It's not efficient when it's cooler out. It takes advantage of that high light, high temperature, low humidity environment that we get even here over the summer. There's a third pathway, which is less common, and it's called CAM photosynthesis. It's a third form. All I want you to really note about this is that it's very similar to C4 photosynthesis, in that CAM allows the plants to take in carbon dioxide at night, and they store it as these kind of 4 carbon molecules. These store it not as carbon dioxide, but as a carbon molecule that can be stored in vacuoles in a part of the leaf's cells, and that way it can make sure it can take in the carbon during the day, and then during the night, and then during the day, if it needs to, it can shut down its stomata and have that backup supply of carbon so that the dark reactions continue to happen. Right? So this avoids the bottleneck by keeping this kind of inventory of carbon that have been taken in at night, and it avoids this this problem of having to close the stomata. It's common in cactus and cacti, and bromeliads, and epiphytes, and then pineapples, which are kind of a modified version of a bromeliad. Okay. One of the last concepts I want you to know about for this lecture is the notion of carbon partitioning, right? So we talked about how plants take in their carbon and they fix their carbon. The question then becomes like, where do you put your carbon? What do you want your carbon to go into? So if we think about this, we're going to think about both the evolution and selection of plants over time, right? So the evolution of plants in natural ecosystems and the selection of plants for agroecosystems. So plants have evolved to allocate their fixed carbon to different structures, right? So once you've got this carbon, what do you do with it? Well, the diagram on the left gives you one thought about it. I could put my carbon into, so normally we think about this, carbon goes from the leaves, we sequester it there, it goes through a path like the branches, and it might go into a fruit. But if I'm a plant that's evolving, not that plants think about this, but they have to decide, do I need to put more of my carbon into building up more leaves if I don't have enough light? Do I need to put it into building more roots if I need to get more nutrients or more water? Do I need to have more stem so that I can reach a little higher and maybe outcompete something else in my environment? Or do I need to put some carbon into a flower to attract a pollinator, and then into seeds to get dispersed and reproduce, right? Obviously, a plant undergoing evolution doesn't make decisions about how to allocate this, but it's kind of through the process of kind of mutation and variability, there's a selection process, right? That it gets tweaked, the allocation gets tweaked to favor the carbon partitioning that gives plants an advantage, right? And so if you created a fruit that was small and not tasty to any disperser around you, that might not be a good choice. If you chose not to put carbon into your roots, and you ended up getting kind of desiccated during a drought, that wouldn't be very good of an idea, right? So it's essentially plants get selected naturally based on having allocated or partitioned carbon kind of appropriately or advantageously. So human selection amplifies this process of partitioning, right? So you can think about this as a garlic plant, right? So what do we do for garlic? We want to select garlic plants that might do better at creating a big head, a big kind of clove and a big head, right? So we might not want to have huge flowers. You can see the flower forming on the scape in the kind of beginning in the kind of lower third of this photo. Because when we grow garlic, we don't rely on plants to flower, be pollinated, and then reproduce by seed. We're going to take cloves, harvest them, and then replant some of them to go again, right? So we want to actually alter it. In fact, this is the time of year that we might be kind of picking scapes off of these plants so that we stop the garlic from partitioning its carbon up into the scape and up into a flower. And we want it to put more energy down into its cloves, right? So when I think about this conceptually, how does evolution favor certain kinds of carbon partitioning in plants? And then how do we change that or modify that as humans? How do we select for that? Okay. Here's two more examples. You can't see the title across the top. This is carbon partitioning. On the left is a young broccoli. On the right is a gooseberry. Right. So we prefer kind of brassicas or broccoli varieties or cultivars that create bigger flowers. Right. We don't want too many leaves. We want bigger heads, which is the flower. On the right, for berries, we want sweeter berries, bigger berries. We want more sugar, which is carbon, glucose, to go to the berries if we're going to eat them, right? So we select for sweeter ones, and as a result, we're encouraging and choosing plants that partition their carbonate ways that are favorable to us. Okay, so I want to end with just a kind of quick review about what did we cover. We talked about photosynthesis as a key part of the process, and really key for as the foundation for agroecosystems and for ecosystems. We talked about the light and dark reactions. It's important that you understand these two together, right? The one light reaction is converting solar light energy into chemical energy. The dark reaction uses that energy and carbon dioxide to create glucose and start to do the fixation, the carbon fixation process. The third thing that we covered is the fact that stomata, or the opening in leaves, do these two functions of bringing in carbon dioxide and letting out water, and that in high heat and low moisture situations, this creates a challenge for photosynthesis because plants have to shut down their stomata so they don't lose too much moisture, and that doing this can stop the dark reactions. We then talked about different photosynthetic pathways that have evolved. So the C4 pathway and the CAM photosynthetic pathway, both of which find a way or provide a way for plants to continue to bring in carbon dioxide and make it available for the dark reaction, even if the plant has to close its stomata because of high temperature and low humidity. And then lastly, we talked about carbon partitioning and selection, that plants evolved to kind of put their carbon in different places depending on, and natural selection kind of favors certain partitioning over other in different microenvironments. And then in agroecosystems, we do selection to take advantage of that variability. We choose plants that partition their carbon in ways that are favorable to us. Maybe less vegetative growth, maybe less flower and reproduction, and we might wanted to put more into sweeter, better kind of outputs or products. I hope you enjoyed this, and make sure that you take the test, the quiz, that's on As You Learn. Thanks.